Hi, everyone. Just a minute, we'll begin. Wow, welcome back.
Thank you.
You were out of town, and I'm so happy that we're starting these marriage dialogues again. And ever since even last week, this information I'm going to share with you hopefully will really help you reach new heights in your marriage dialogues with your loved ones, not only your spouses, but with everyone, especially our younger generation. The other day I was thinking about something that happened to me once. I was crossing the street and I actually happened to see this woman frantically running after her child. I was watching this, and she got to the destination of reaching her child just in the nick of time to get her out of the street. And she started yelling at her and punching her. And I was like, oh my goodness, she could have lost this child. And now all of a sudden, what is she talking about? Hug her, love her, a miracle just happened. And yet somehow her frenzy, her fear, her panic overtook her to want to teach this daughter a lesson, not to ever do it again. And I was thinking about the dynamic of what was going on in her head, what was going on in her fight and flight mode that just made her lose it all and actually show the opposite of love, as she was so lovingly trying to save her child's life. And as I was seeing this, I thought, gosh, this is everything to do with every relationship. You see someone doing something kind of opposite of what you would have wanted after all the years of what you gave them, or you see some kind of interaction that's triggering in you a feeling of fear and anxiety, because that may appear to you that it seems like they don't love you or they don't care about you. And yet, as we see in this situation, it's really kind of a barometer of exactly the opposite, that they so love you, that they're so nervous about what's going on, that they're maybe triggered and reacting in such a way because of their love for you. So I thought we'd start the discussion today, because I think if we can tackle this and learn the tools of how to really see the moment for what it really is, step back, and think through what is happening around you, that it may not be as it appears, or it may not be what you're thinking about how they feel about you. Take that deep breath and not react when you're emotional and charged up, and save it for later till you have really calmed your senses down, so that you can think clearly before you speak and say the right things that will bring unity and love, instead of this case, the opposite.
So it's interesting because it raises a plethora of issues that are certainly relevant even to the time that we're in now, the time of Nachamu, the time of consolation. After Tisha B'Av, we have this buildup of the 3 weeks and the haftorahs of the punishments, and culminating in the haftorah of Shabbos Chazon. And the idea is that the Jewish people were suffering as a result of their actions having brought about the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Ad kedei kach, to the very extent that the Rebbe speaks about this in several sikhas, that it's not just that we're mourning the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash that was 2,000 years ago, that because it is brought down, that if the Beis Hamikdash is not built in your lifetime, it's as if you caused the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Now that's harsh language, and certainly harsh for our Rebbe. But the Rebbe's point was expressly and implicitly that we have an obligation to do everything we can to rectify our own behavior. And in that rectification will bring about the coming of Mashiach and the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash. If it's not happening, we have to take personal ownership of that, of our own behavior, and try to make the world a better place for other Yidden and even the Goyim. But ultimately still comes Tisha B'Av. We have to fast. We have to mourn physically. We have to abide by the halachic implications of mourning, Aveilus. But then comes post Tisha B'Av and of course Tu B'Av, the day of love, the day of great simcha. And then the Shabbosim that follow and the Haftorahs that follow of consolation begin with Nachamu Nachamu, double consolation. That gets to this idea that when you're confronted with something tragic, whether someone's attacking you that you love and you don't understand, or whether some tragedy happens to yourself, God forbid, Rahman litzlan, lo aleinu, or to someone else, God forbid. There's a moment in which you suffer that, but you've got to immediately move past that suffering, that victimization, that tragedy, and begin consoling yourself and consoling the other. It gets to what my wife is talking about when she's referring to not reacting so quickly to the attack or the tragedy, because obviously it occurs in two circumstances, right? Literally the baby, something bad is about to happen, or you see your spouse or your children. It's usually our children, right? We see our children who we love tremendously, not, in our view, not fulfilling their potential and not getting ahead. And we point out their failures and we scold them and we push them and we drive them. And we do so not for the reason that we talked about during the last podcast. Remember the last podcast, we talked about we all have faults, but what we tend to do is look in the other person's tent. The famous Mendel Futterfast story where the guards were always looking in the prisoners' pockets for the dice or the playing cards that they were gambling with. But the clever Ganavim, the Goyish thieves, were pickpocketers, and they knew how to, as soon as the guards would come, they would take the dice or the playing cards and slip them into the guards' pockets, and they would never look at themselves. And then as soon as they were leaving, they would take them back out. It's not that. It's not matovu oholecho. It's not looking into someone else's tent and avoiding and looking for the criticism. That's not this phenomenon. This phenomenon is where you're doing it sincerely. You really do love them. And you're engaged in that, whether it's your children. So that's one situation. Or it could be a spouse. Your husband or your wife is not living up to their potential. They're not learning enough Torah. They're not making the minyan, whatever it may be, and you're criticizing them. And that criticism comes from a good place because you know their potential is so great. The question is how do you articulate that desire to help them move ahead? So you can be like the mother who sees her child in the street and react, or you can pause. Now, there's another circumstance where this phenomenon occurs, and that's what my wife alluded to, after talking about the circumstance of the child in the street, and that is someone is attacking you that you love, criticizing you, rebuking you, whatever it may be.
Or ignoring.
Or ignoring you. Yeah, that would be a classic example. And you react in anger, frustration. And again, not because you have something against them, not because you don't love them, not even because you're necessarily really angry with them, but because the love that you have for them, the commitment that you have is so intense that it angers you or frustrates you. It makes you boil over when you're just not able to communicate with them in the way that you want to.
Sometimes it's also depression, like they get so sad, they become apathetic, they have despair, they don't do as much in the home, they're not as available for intimacy. I mean, it also can be an interaction that sort.
Okay, so
or lack of interaction.
Right. So the person who the mother in your metaphor, right, the muscle of the child in the street, might not be yelling at her child. She might become depressed and not speak to the child. Or
no, in this kind of circumstances in a marriage.
Right.
I mean, like when I tell this story, I say, imagine if the woman would run to the child and hold the child, take the child's hand, feel my heart, see how scared I was. I love you so much. Instead of having that heartbeat, like move them to the place of anger and, a loud, reaction and even a physical reaction that is damaging to the relationship, rather than take that situation and make it actually work to your benefit and create more closeness, even as you're trying to portray the message.
Right. And, that's interesting because we know from the Rambam and Hilchos Deus, the laws of character traits, that the Rambam was an advocate of the mean. You don't lean in one direction or another. You're not too stingy, but you're not too profligate. You're not too excessive in giving things away. Otherwise, you'll end up with nothing of your own. You're not too energetic, but you're not too lazy. You try to find the middle ground between extremes. Now, the difficulty in that, just as a parenthetical, derech agav, as we would say, is you have to be pretty adept at identifying the extremes to know what the mean is, right? I don't ever want to get political in these conversations, but in this day and age, to understand what the extremes are on the political right and the political left, to be in the middle ground would be fairly difficult, since the extremes are pretty extreme and all over the place. So, but once and of course, that's the purpose of a Rav in some circumstances and a Mashpia in others. And we'll talk about that in a podcast to come. But the Rambam says there are two character traits that we don't strive to be in the middle ground. And one character trait is humility, that we abhor arrogance and do everything we can to be as humble in spirit as we possibly can. Now, again, for another podcast,
write these down.
I was thinking exactly the same thing. We should discuss the difference between hubris or arrogance, gasus, and hitnasus, meaning holding ourselves up, carrying ourselves in a princely manner as Jews, as Am Segula, as the chosen Bnei Bechor of the Eibishter. And what that difference is, that Ebba has several sichas on that, and the difference between being bittul, humble in the way that bittul means, and being self-effacing, which a Jew should never be.
So I just want to say that when the chosen people, like I heard actually an interesting word on that God went to all the people and that we chose God, like that. So, because sometimes,
Right.
yeah.
But the reality is that being a Yid with the Nefesh Elokis, a godly soul, puts us in a position of responsibility.
Right.
And so just like a prince or a king, and mostly a prince, that's the metaphor for the word hitnasus. Just like a prince, his duties, of course, it's what Prince Harry is apparently rebelling against. The duties are an obligation. There's more of an obligation how to carry yourself regally, but not arrogantly.
Exactly.
And that deserves discussion. But there's another trait, and that's really the point here, that the Rambam says, 2 traits, just 2. We stay away from arrogance, and the other one is anger. Under no circumstance, under Jewish law, is someone permitted to get angry and just react. Now, we all do, but it's not permitted. And the Rambam has a wonderful formula for avoidance of anger, both for your children and your spouse. And he says, when it's appropriate that you, as the man of the home, the father of the children, should express dissatisfaction or rebuke or criticism or something, you don't. And at that moment, of course, you're naturally angry. The Rambam says you don't respond at that time. You make sure that you're absolutely calm, cool, and collected, as the saying goes. And then you can feign a little anger. But the Rambam makes the point that has to come with love. Hasidus is very clear about this. Hasidus says, when you're going to engage in criticism, necessary criticism or necessary rebuke, you might do so with your right hand, but you gather them in with your left hand. But my wife says the opposite.
I don't know.
No, because when you rebuke with your right hand is your chesed. The rebuke always comes with love, always comes with kindness. And then you gather them in and love them with your strong hand, your gevurah. Your gevurah is not used to hurt someone you love. Your gevurah is used to love them. As we know, the sweetening of the gevurahs, right? There's a special concept in Hasidus that gevurah actually can be used to sweeten the higher levels of strictness, so that while they might be strict in some sense, they're experienced as sweetness, as kindness. And
love that. You know, there's a story in the Tanakh that says that when Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron was with the staff, and the whole miracle of the staff turning to the snakes, and then in the end, Aaron caused the staff to turn into the snakes, and then the Egyptians made the miracle themselves and made all, right, and then had the snakes come about, and then the miracle was that also he turned the snakes back into the staff so that the staff would swallow the snakes. And the question was, why such a miracle again? To show us that when you're trying to swallow up someone's snake-like behavior, you should be like a staff and not like a snake. You should take the leadership of and rising above your emotional turmoil that you're going through with them, and remember the staff of Aaron, Moshe, and love, and not be like snake-like in trying to, diminish or deal with their snake-like behavior.
Right. So why don't we get into some of the prescriptions for dealing with the moment?
Oh, that's good. Well, for sure, we want to calm our beating heart. We have to kind of like scan our body. What is our body going through right now? There's certain symptoms that the bodies portray when we're about to lose our equanimity, when we're about to like lose our, patience. Sometimes it's our heart beating fast. Sometimes some other person might have their stomach churning. Sometimes their face is starting to like feel hot. And if you could already train yourself to somatically scan your body to see where you're at with what they just did or said, then you can know now's not the time to talk because I'm really emotionally charged. And say to yourself, like, I don't have to deal with this right now, because if I deal with this right now, the likelihood is I'm going to say things that are either inappropriate or damaging and will cause distancing between me and the other rather than the unity and love that I so maybe desperately want. So that's a first step. Next is remember the sentence we always say, in righteousness do speak. That before that sentence, there's a word, in silence, righteousness do speak. So taking the moment and being quiet, thinking it through, calming your body down, seeing the best tactic. Maybe they're really in a very fiery mode and you reacting, maybe like putting gasoline on their fire. Maybe wait till their fire dies down, maybe in a day, maybe in an hour, but be silent for a moment and not be so reactive. Taking that time can then help you speak more righteously, because now you're not talking from, an emotional pull. Now you're talking through logic, reasoning, and like a perception that has different maybe angles in ways that you're going to look at it because you took that time to be silent. Next thing, always find compassion in your heart and realize no one is 100% perfect. Just like you have your moments of not being perfect, they too have their moments. Yeah, maybe they have more moments, but we can't compare. I remember learning in Tanya that one person's lack of saying like a good intent while praying in God's eyes could be just as equal as someone purposely rebelling against God, because they may have been born with a fiery temperament. They would have maybe been a murderer, but they're not. They may have been in a bad family dynamics. Maybe they weren't gifted with the knowledge and the capabilities of integrating information and actualizing it, where God maybe blessed you with a greater acumen and a greater intellectual wherewithal. So really developing that habit of having compassion for the other, then you'll interact with them with more compassion.
So usually my wife is the one who brings Hasidus and understandings of relationships down to practical terms. So I'm going to get even more practical, and I'll let her then smooth out the rough edges. So those were three very nice articulations of the steps. Now the question would become, so how do you get there?
Oh.
And how do you get there as a couple? So I would suggest something that my wife and I have done over naturally or quite organically to some extent, although I'm certain that my wife has led me there subtly and with nuance and love. And that is, we spend a lot of time talking about the process. So one of the things we've done over 33 years is have a date night, or even more regularly, take daily walks. We certainly try. We're not so successful sometimes given our schedules and what have you, but pretty regularly. And during those times, especially the walks, date night is usually just me looking at my wife and drinking good wine. But the walks, we spend a lot of time talking about that, either in kind of theory or even in our own lives. And that is, So if someone is agitated in the relationship, or both parties are, and again, it can be spouses or with children, one person can behave properly and hold themselves back and do all these things, have these recognitions that, you know, that their spouse isn't perfect, they're not perfect, their spouse isn't perfect, have compassion, et cetera, et cetera. But it's better if both sides recognize, look, when we have a disagreement, and there's not a couple in the world that have been together for any length of time that haven't had disagreements. We see it by Avram and Sarah, Yitzhak and Rivka, Yaakov and his wives, right? Moshe and Sipporah. Saw it between siblings, Moshe and Aaron, Moshe and Miriam. We see it, we all know that. I don't need to explain it with biblical examples, but we know that happens. But if you also talk about what are we going to do when that happens? Are we going to do what many couples do, God forbid, which is bring their little scripts of victimhood and complaints and then regurgitate them like they do? Well, I remember you did this and you did that. And it's the same conversation they had 5 years ago. It just got some addendum to it with all the new complaints they've had. And oftentimes you'll find that arguing couples will go back, to situations that occurred when they were dating before they got married, or the first Shana Rishona, the first year they're married. It goes back that far. They just dredge this stuff up because they never resolve it, and it just sits there kind of gurgling, festering. And if you talk about what you're going to do during the process, okay, when we have these disagreements, so we should have maybe some code words and recognize that we separate, we go our separate ways, we calm down, we do something else, we learn, we exercise, we meditate, whatever it may be, you pray, but you don't allow yourself to keep engaging.
Yeah. I mean, there's a sentence that says, what is insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again when it doesn't work. What is that said of that famous Einstein?
Maybe Freud.
I think it was Einstein.
Okay, but the fact is that you don't disengage as a form of warfare, right? That's what my wife was mentioning earlier, where you just turn off. I'm done with this conversation. You have an understanding between the two of you how you're going to disengage, because you're going to have those arguments, and you understand how. Now, many couples, not many, but certainly some couples, know how to do this organically, right? Let's put this on the back shelf. Let's talk about this later when we both calm down. But if that's not done organically, then talk about the process. And by the way, a couple can develop it organically and then lose it and then have to talk about it. So there's not a static situation in any relationship, because you're always changing, you're always growing, you're always having different experiences. And while you're a couple and in unity, you have to recognize that you're still two different people. Now, the other thing I would say, and this applies to husbands and wives, and it applies to children, in terms of how to get to those three levels of kind of a self-awareness about how not to react inappropriately in a stressful situation, is you have to be ultimately committed and loyal to the relationship.
Very true.
If you don't have that,
true.
If in the back of your mind it's, I want to get a divorce, I want to get I want to get out of this thing, he's not what I wanted, she's not what I wanted, if you have any of that, then you're going to be suffering. I don't normally mention these things, but I do kind of long distance racing. And one of the things you learn when you're doing a long distance race, whether it's running, swimming, or biking, or all three, is we call them bad wolves, especially if you're doing swing biking and running, and you get into the run, and you all of a sudden everything is aching and sore, and you don't really want to be there. And so you say, oh, I'm going to quit. Well, what we find is the individual who DNFs, did not finish, the individual who quits one time, when you look at their race record, they quit more often than not. In other words, because in the back of their mind, they've opened the possibility of failure. And once that possibility is open, it's like a floodgate. It's always there, and it's always going to bother you. To take that rather base or crass example and move it into a relationship situation. In one of the things that my father, God bless him, and God rest his soul, drilled into his children, certainly into me, was the most important thing that an individual has is loyalty. What does that mean? Loyalty is part of, is the bigger part of commitment. And so a Yid is expected to be absolutely loyal to the Eibishter. We call that Kabbalas Ol. That is really the language of loyalty and commitment. And then from there, an absolute commitment and loyalty to your spouse and to your children. Now, most of us parents have intrinsically a absolute loyalty to our children. They are flesh and blood. You know, the wife, the husband you marry, they're not your flesh and blood. They're your soulmate. But your children are mamish, your flesh and blood. And you see it all the time. You know, God forbid you read in the headlines of some terrible event that some young man or young woman did, and the parents, you know, while they're crushed and they feel bad for the victims, still love their child. They're not going to walk away from them. Now we know parents who do, and chas v'shalom, and it's a terrible thing, but it's not natural. Parents, a healthy parent would never walk away or give up on their child, no matter how disappointed, frustrated they are. They're flesh and blood. You know, the metaphor, the mice of the story of the king, and my wife is much better at stories than I am of remembering them. The king who sends his son away.
Yeah,
right?
But he's like telling everyone, don't feed my child, don't do this. But then the one person disobeys the king and feeds the child. But deep down inside, the king is so happy that everyone, yeah.
The king, you know, whether out of anger or possibly out of trying to teach his son selfhood, you know, tells everyone not to help the boy, but in fact, he was very happy when someone did. Similarly, the other story, which is exactly on point, the king, it's always a king and the son who sends his son out, and with, you know, he's a bit of a silver spoon in the mouth kind of son. You know, he's very privileged and he's not maturing well and he's not behaving well. The father gives him a certain amount of money and sends him out into the world to learn and experience the world. And of course, he goes out gambling and he loses all of his money, and then he starts wandering around and gets, you know, all kinds of mishaps, and to the point where he even forgets his native tongue. Decades later, he doesn't even remember, but he has these visions of his father, and lo and behold, he finds his way back to the palace, and he's not even sure what, he recognizes it, but he's not sure. But then something deep within him, and he calls out, "Father." Or it didn't even call out in the language. He just called out in some tongue that he had heard. And the father heard the voice and immediately, you know, opened the gates and opened his arms. And that's the commitment.
So in a relationship, and where it can be more difficult is in a spousal relationship, because it's not flesh and blood. And we go into when you have a child, you have expectations, you have desires, you want the best for your child, you want him or her to be, smart and loving and kind and chassidus and all the good things. But with a spouse, you presumably have done your homework and they've done theirs, and you don't just expect it. That was kind of the deal. I asked you to marry me, you agreed, or you asked me to marry, and vice versa, and we agreed, and we entered into a contract, a kasuba with the Eibishter, that we were going to.
Yeah, do you remember the last conversation we had in the shul? And the person wanted to find out about how we started our dating, so you have to write that on your.
Okay. Right. So that is a kind of contractual obligation. So when the other party fails in the obligation, what do? Well, you can sue for damages. Being a lawyer, I can tell you that's the case. Or you can say, you induced me into this contract under fraudulent pretenses. You aren't who you said you were.
Well, but that they have to read the book, and we have to discuss that.
Right.
As part of the deal that God makes, that he purposely blinds one and the other not to see the not good in the other.
Right.
And so then he takes the blinders off after marriage. So it's really not that.
Right.
It's really not
Right.
that.
So, but and I'll talk about that in legal terms as well. But if you make that argument in your mind that you're not who you were supposed to be, you're not who we obligated, and so therefore I don't want to just sue for damages. I don't want to keep the relationship and just get you pay me the damages, which can be a form of kind of disharmony in a home, because that's where it's constant argument about who owes who what. But the other one is the abandonment of the relationship, where you sue for rescission. If you're induced to enter into an agreement fraudulently, you can choose to sue for damages or sue to terminate the contract and unwind it all. It's called rescission. And that's what's in the head of many people, especially in the modern time, where we see divorce increasing even among Frumkeit. And it's because in the back of their mind, this
narrative.
It's not that we Jews, unlike Catholics, for example, we Jews know that divorce is a possibility under Catholic law. You're not allowed to enter into a marriage and then get it divorced. They have this thing with an annulment, but in effect, once it's done, it's done.
The Rebbe, though,
Right, we'll get to that.
Yeah,
but
you should say that.
I'll let you say.
No, the Rebbe did say, that we have to treat marriage like Adam and Chava, that there's no other person. And that,
right, but right. And so that's the difference between Jewish law and Catholic canon. And that is Jewish law permits divorce.
Right. But it's like free choice, because otherwise, if we were commanded to stay married, then the person wouldn't have the free choice to stay. Right. And for the purpose of free choice.
And so that gets to the next point, which is the point that we were making, which is the previous point, which is commitment.
Right.
Commitment is about free choice, right? If you don't have free will, if you don't have bechira chofshis to choose to be committed, not choose to be committed, to be committed. It's not there's a choice involved, but it's a state of being. It's a state of mind that this is a relationship that is so much a part of me that it can't be undone. And that commitment, that absolute loyalty to the relationship would remove any thought, any possibility that I can quit this race. I can DNF, did not finish. Right? That's just not a possibility. And that, when you have those two elements, first the commitment, I did them in reverse, but first that absolute commitment to the relationship. I'm going to do whatever it takes. And there's examples you always point to the Rebbe. By the way, in this context, I couldn't recommend more wonderful book by an absolutely wonderful author, Reaching New Heights in Marriage. Because anyone who's read that book understands its value. Do you have a copy of
Well,
it
I
here?
actually also have this right now, which is a workbook. which-
Kindness in Marriage,
Yeah.
okay.
And this
But
one.
my favorite one is,
Well, this is based
Yeah, the
on this,
workbook is
and
good,
this is,
right.
it's really beautiful the way she made bullet points and it's everything that's kind of in here, but in a workbook format.
and in simple format, the book is, with a lot of anecdotes. But it makes this point that if you've come into the relationship with this absolute commitment, there's nothing that can happen that's going to end this relationship. Nothing. We will always be together. There's just no question about that. Then getting to the next level, which is thinking about and talking about the process when we do disagree. How do we respond to that as individuals? You can decide for yourself, hopefully after reading my wife's book, but talk about it so that when you disengage, so that you don't make things worse, you're not insulted by the disengagement, right? If you talked about the fact, well, when we get upset with one, let's agree that we'll have a code word, or we'll go our separate ways, but we always want to, before the night's up, make certain that we've been able to come back together, or if it's late at night, first thing in the morning, so that it's not festering, and that we take the time to talk. And you might say, I'm busy, I have to get to work, I have to do this, I have to do that. What did the first principle? First principle was, you're absolutely committed to this relationship. So that means there's nothing, literally nothing more important than resolving those disagreements in a calm, cool, and collected way. And if that means calling in sick for work, calling sick for work has happened. If that means taking a sick day or paid vacation or an unpaid.
And now these days it's so easy. Everyone's so scared that if you're sick, you're going to be at work. No, stay home.
Yeah, there you go.
Wow. I do have to say that there was once I was at a Shabbaton with Rabbi Leibel Wolf, and he was talking about the idea of how unfair is it that people are so pleasant and nice and have all the self-mastery and all the ability to hold their cool when dealing with other people, but close the door, and when they're in their own home, it's that much more challenging. So people in the marketplace, and just a minute ago you were so upset and not able to handle yourself. So he was actually saying that the reason why is that people have unhealthy attachments to their loved ones. And because of that unhealthy attachment, and I'll get more into detail, then that bothers them so much that then they have a difficult time controlling their emotions. So if some nobody treats you not nice on the street, honks at you, who are they to me? They're whatever. If a drunk person, starts cursing at you at the street, you have no relation. You didn't do nothing for them. And so you don't feel as hurt that they're, cursing you. You see that they have an issue. So the unhealthy attachment is that we tend to feel needy of the other to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. So when the behavior is not as expected, then they feel so jaded. Like, what? I did this for you and that for you. And now this is what I get back? You should make me feel good about myself. Show me that you love me after everything I did for you. And they don't see that. And they're kind of making the calculation and the analytical analysis that behavior is because they don't love me and don't appreciate everything I did. And then that reaction can so easily happen. So if you kind of take imaginary scissors and say to yourself, I'm not going to have that. I'm going to cut away that tie between me and the other. I don't want this relationship for them to make me feel good about me, or to make me feel that all my efforts for giving and whatever giving I did is between really me and God. It was an opportunity to bring out my own godly essence. I want the relationship between me and the other to be pure and freed from this unhealthy attachment. I am who I am, and I'm worthy of being because I'm a God creation in this earth. I don't need other people to make me feel good about myself. And if people could understand how these unhealthy attachments to the other is affecting their relationship and deplug from that, strengthen yourself to feel good about yourself because of all the good things you do for them and for your family, then their interaction can be a lot healthier and less challenging when they, kind of don't behave toward you and the expectations that you want.
So note from what my wife just said, that what we've now discussed in the previous podcast and continued now and what we've discussed here are three different kinds, rubrics, categories of let's just call it not good behavior, right? So the first one we discussed last week and continued into this, not last week, 2 weeks ago, and continued in this podcast, is the idea of criticizing and judging the other because you're not prepared or you don't want to look at yourself. And in fact, we can even migrate that a little bit and say that could be even an example of one of the, and the Alter speaks about this with the goy who is bothering the person who's davening, that can also be an aspect of projection, the modern psychological term. But the Alter Rebbe had it hundreds of years ago when the Alter Rebbe explains that when the Gentiles making noise and bothering you in shul, and what you have to realize is that what you're seeing there is a reflection of what you're doing to yourself. So oftentimes we get angry at the other and we're not prepared to look at ourselves because we're projecting what we know subconsciously, unconsciously, somehow innately we fail at, but we're going to find it in the other so we can point it out in them and avoid confronting ourselves. But without projection, it's just a human thing. We look at others, the guards are looking at the prisoners. So, and there, most of us, some of us don't, have a fair amount of self-love. And so, or even those of us who don't have self-love don't want to be self-critical. We don't want to do the hard work of looking at ourselves in the mirror, by Kriya Shema Amita in the night and in the morning when we say Matovu Olech, when we Modani rather, when we wake up in the morning, we don't doubt. Those are the times where we do Cheshbon Nefesh at night and in the morning, and we think about what we did and what we're going to do and how we're going to better ourselves. That's hard work. It's much easier just to kind of go with the flow, status quo. Maybe talk about your plans and your goals or think about it a little bit, but immediately forget about them and just go with the flow, whatever you feel like. It's hard work. So it's easy to criticize the other. That was the first. The second one that my wife brought up with the mother and the child in the street, and we've now talked about in the context of husbands and wives and even children, is that we expect so much from them that it can be frustrating when they're just not living up to their potential, or they merely stepped in front of a terrible tragedy of a car, God forbid, and I saved them. But I'm so tense from that experience that I just react. So that's the second. Now my wife is bringing out a third example that I think is important, and that is the situation where you're not the initial anger, the initial emotion is not anger. The initial emotion is dependency on the other person to provide you with some kind of self-validation. And when they're not giving it the way you want to get it, you get angry with them.
Exactly.
And there, the complexities of a person's insecurities and so forth, I believe, are a result of two things we've already talked about in some part. And that is, one, the individual doesn't look in his own pockets or her own pockets sufficiently well and really be honest with themselves. Because if they're looking in their own pockets, they're looking in their own tent, and they're doing the cheshbon nefesh, the self-analysis at night by Kriyas Shema on Amita, when we say the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one at night, what are we supposed to be doing? We're supposed to be contemplating, what did we accomplish today that we wanted to accomplish? What did we not accomplish that we want to now accomplish tomorrow? What should we add to what kind of person am I? How do I my fellow? And my wife just has to ask someone to mute themselves. Another one of those technical things. Oh, okay, they did.
I think so,
Yeah. So this is the technical aspect of doing these things. Neither my wife or I are really technically proficient.
there we go.
There we go. So if the person has, on a daily basis, prepared to really analyze who they are, what they are, their shortcomings and their strengths, they will, if not immediately, grow over time, less dependent on validation from the other. Now, I will say this. In any good couple's relationship, a loving relationship, there should be a fair amount of validation one to the other. That's what, remember, the other precondition of these things are loyalty is all about. And it's not just words. You're not just validating because you were told in my wife's book you should validate your loved one. You're doing it because you have this absolute commitment to the relationship. And if that means I have an absolute commitment to our relationship, I have an absolute commitment to this young lady here. And that means that my commitment is going to translate into me looking for that which is good and positive and buttressing that up. Now, it might also mean to lovingly and subtly and sincerely pointing out shortcomings so that she can improve and vice versa. And those are best done having, again, that absolute commitment. And then in those moments where you've set aside the walks my wife and I have, date night, although as I said, I spent most of the date night looking at my wife and drinking wine. So, but it means having talked about how are we going to go about this? When I see something that's not quite right, how would you like me to address it? What's the best way? And back and forth. And it's not artificial if it's done through that sense of absolute commitment.
There are those, though, that it's very hard for them to have discussions with their spouse because they're really not okay with any word, any criticism. It sometimes takes a lot of years to create that very loving bond with them that eventually they'll be more open to hear an advice, your opinion. And sometimes you have to be going really slow, and that's okay. The reward is, like Tanya says, there's a short way, but it's really going to be the long way. The long way, but it's really the short way, because you'll eventually get there in a good place. And that's the most difficult aspect in most people's relationship. In Rabbi Ginsburg's book, he writes, cultivating infinite patience. Just like the Jewish people when they were, trying to get from Egypt to the Holy Land, and many incidences, because they did not cultivate infinite patience, it forestalled and backfired on them. So also with your children, I mean, how old, children can be, and yet you still have to infinitely wait for them to achieve that milestone. And it's just a fact. So,
And I would say to those individuals, I'm not a counselor, my wife is. And maybe I'm the opposite of it. But in my view, as we say, anios dosia, my humble view, an individual who learns how to pray and understands the prayers and is doing these other things, the cheshbon nefesh, the self-accounting and so forth, can't help but understand the importance of self-criticism, meaning, I don't use that word in the negative way. I mean self-critique.
Yeah, analysis.
Right, because criticism in and of itself is meaningless. Critique, what have I done right? Right, you have to know what you've done right so you can do more of it. And where have I not achieved my goals? You don't have to say, what have I done wrong? Where have I not been able to achieve the goals? And then how do I go about achieving those? And you can't get through tachnan, the prayer we say most mornings and most afternoons, where we're asking God for forgiveness for all of our sins, and not understand the importance of critique. And again, pointing to the Rambam and Hilchos Tshuva, the laws of repentance, the very first step is being moeded, is conceding. I just haven't done well here. If you're not there, right? And even in the 12-step programs and what have you, right? What's the first step? The first step is acknowledging I've got a problem.
Right, but again, children can be very blocked, and they cannot see the truth of who they are, and they will not as easily receive that kind of. So we have to, in the relationships, like we are patient with the child, that we have to be aware that some people aren't as open and as willing to face the facts about their weaknesses. So
right, and I was referring mostly to the husband and wife.
Right, but that's also
right.
A lot of
right.
clients of mine say, no matter what I say in a gentle way, they will not accept my critique. They will not accept that and so I just say, you just work on yourself.
Right.
And let go, just let go for now, because they're just not ready.
And that's the halacha, right?
Right.
Because we have an obligation, a dioraisa from the Torah itself, obligation, toichacha, to rebuke. However, the halacha
Rebuke
is very complicated. And the essential rebuke is that you absolutely have to know that the rebuke in the fashion that you're going to give it, one, is sincere, and that it will be makubal, it will be acceptable, it'll be received in a positive way. If not, hold it back. I think we've run the hour.
Yeah, let's see if there's any questions, and thank you for joining. And I hope that this really, from our hearts to your hearts, and I'll just check the chat here. It seems like there's some, it's a little far from me. The question is, are there any ideas of how to approach things with someone who is not emotionally in touch and they just blow off everything a spouse says? I think that happens to most relationships, actually. I mean, I've been a counselor for 33 years. I have seen it again and again happen. I heavily suggest people to visualize. Visualize the person being open to receive. Visualize the person the way he was meant to be on the face of this earth. Really visualize the person succeeding, and all the while respecting them at all costs. There's many stories. We know the famous story that Aaron just really honored everyone, and so much so that it brought about these really very challenging individuals to really come back to Hashem. We know the story with Bruria, when her husband was so upset with the wicked ones of the generation, and she said, "Are you praying for them?" And soon after, he switched tracks of really having compassion toward them and praying for them, and we're taught that they turned around. There was a story with the Rebbe, where he was too friendly and kind to those that were, seemingly not deserving of that. And he ran kind of questioning to his father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, asking, are they right? Am I too, friendly? Should I be more stern and more distant and show them that they can't do that? And then maybe that'll change their ways. And the Frierdiker Rebbe, said, no, it's that special kind of extra love that you would give, let's say, a disabled child, that is needed to help turn them closer to you. Tough love is out, basically.
So there's an interesting analog to that in my profession. But before I get there, let me just say that, in this idea of visualization, that your partner, your wife, your husband is fulfilling all of the expectations and doing things the way they should be done, comes from the idea of Tracht gut wird sein gut, think good and it will be good. And that, of course, has the added advantage, and we know that Ebba spoke about Tracht gut wird sein gut in the context of quantum physics, that how you measure something in quantum physics is how it actually performs. So light can be a wave or a beam, and if you measure it, the photon level,
the conscious thought of yours is that you're going to
Right.
measure it.
you're going to measure it as a beam,
Yeah.
then that's how it'll be measured. But if you think of it as, if your conscious thought and your measurement setup is as a wave, it appears as a wave, even though the two are contradictions. A beam is not the same as a wave. And we're talking about the photon level. So it's not like, maybe it's a wave of photons. And this also translates at a very, very practical level, not just a Hasidic level, not just a quantum mechanics level, but at a very practical level. In my profession as a trial lawyer, I've come to study and know expertly macro body language and something that we also call micro body language. There's microfacial expressions. And so an individual who's thinking positively about the other, visualizing positively about the other, consciously, their body language, their microfacial expressions, they don't even realize they're doing, are going to be transmitting to the other person, I'm a better person. I'm a better person. And like that beam of light or that wave of light, when the other person is constantly being treated, or not even treated, but is being surrounded by this positive vitality, this positive flow, it's going to have an impact. If it has an impact on a photon, how much more so is it going to have an impact on a living, breathing, sentient being? And of course, the experiments in this that we see in real terms, for example, plants. If you have house plants and you play, hard grunge music, ugly music, vile music, the plants don't do as well. If you play nice, classical music, pleasant music, fine-tuned Hasidic nigunim, the plants flourish. Now, why is that? Because what surrounds them is positivity. What surrounds them is pleasant. And a plant, a tzomeach, right? If organic matter can respond that way, ala chat kama v'kama medaber, a human being who not only is organic and not only is sentient, that they experience senses, but they can think, they can speak, they can feel these things.
One of the people that I've been actually helping train to be a counselor was telling me that she's been using these techniques. She's also been putting very calm music and with frequencies, and she just noticed such a difference, and more people are coming to her, and it really has an enormous attraction energies. So for sure that this is what.
One more example. I remember when I was a teenager, I was at camp, And one of the days we put mattresses on the floor and these big plastic like tunnels that they would put a fan on one end so it would stay inflated. They probably wouldn't allow that this day and age with all the liability of the thing collapsing and so forth, but in those days we did. And then they had lights around the clear plastic tunnels outside, and the kids sat in on the, the other boys would sit in on the mattress, and you would, the rest of the room was dark other than the lights, and the lights were colored. You had blue lights, red lights, yellow lights, green lights. And after you were in there and we were learning, studying, praying, davening, whatever we were doing, playing, and we were supposed to be in there for like an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. And when we came out, there was a group of part of the campers where we were switching all the time, were outside watching us. And it was fascinating because when you were inside, you didn't recognize that when you were on the red lights, you were getting more angry, you were more aggressive, there were more fist fights, either playfully or not. And when you were in a soft blue light, or one of the lights, people were taking naps, playing pleasantly. And of course, inside the little bubble, you didn't have a self-awareness that your behavior was changing. But the kids outside could literally watch the difference, and they would tell you, and when it was your turn to watch, you would be an observer. And it was a fascinating little experiment that to this day, I recall, in other words, the environment, the pleasantness or the not so pleasantness in the environment. Of course, what do we know in the Jewish world, the Hasidic world? That when you surround yourself with Torah, with emes, when you learn, when you daven, when you're engaged in the mitzvahs, when you're not just engaged when you're supposed to be engaged, but you're imbued with that, that has an impact. It is part of the expression of fake it till you make it, right? Because when you're faking it and you're not really feeling the mitzvah, but you're doing it all the time, eventually it has its impact and it finally becomes made, right? It's part of you.
But by the way, it's documented.
Go
Yeah, but the light things is documented. It's not
right. I know. They copied it, I think, from the old social psychological experiments.
Wow. Okay. So blessings for an amazing week. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I felt like we took a walk together and shared some hopefully good insights. And we'll be back again next Tuesday. And whatever rest of the questions we'll look at and hopefully tackle it next week.
Sei gesund.
See you later.
Thank you.
Yes, you guys can continue on. I look at the questions here so that way it doesn't get, there's more questions. Hold on. Wow, there's more here. Okay. I'm going to take a picture of the questions so that way it won't get lost.
Yeah, are we?
Thank you for your thing here. Wow. Next time I have to put the phone on the other side so that way I can read it better because it was on my left side, farther away from me, and it's hard to read it from so far without looking like weird reading it. Wow, thank you for joining. So beautiful, like this chance to be together with my spouse and share. Yeah, so how to be without tough love. Just do the tough love. If you're going to do it on yourself, work on yourself and improve yourself. Be more kind. I was going to share that, today's Tanya is Hashem created the world, Behi Baram, which means he created the world with the hey. But if you make the arrangement of these letters, it says Be Avraham, create a peaceful and good world, like the way Abraham created peace and love through his kindness. So Bezrat Hashem, tough love is out, and really loving and patience and compassion goes a long way. I hope that we'll address that a little further as we go down this journey together. See you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. It was very, very helpful and beautiful.
Thank you.